Tenders and Tenders for Charter. Chris Anderson had a different title for that at the last Monaco event, something about tenders of the heart or something. But while we did talk about this at the last Monaco event, there's a different slant to it today. Chris, David Moss, Peter Chesla, and Tom Gresh from NFP, one of our sponsors. Thank you, Tom.
Chris Anderson. I'm an attorney with Robert Allen Law, and I'm joined today by my esteemed colleagues here. So we have Tom Gresh with NFP. He's an insurance guru. We have David Moss, who is my counterpart in many transactions and an expert, obviously, in yacht law. And then Pete Chesla from the Marshall Islands, who's here to give us the flag state's perspective. So today we're here to talk about the unloved stepchildren of the yachting industry. Tenders seem to always, everybody gets excited about the big boat transaction, but the tenders, they present their own legal and insurance risks that are separate from the main vessel and often not fully contemplated in a transaction. So we're here to talk about them. So tenders are, it's kind of a blanket term. We talk about tenders, really I guess auxiliary vessels would be a more legally appropriate term. You can be anything from a jet ski all the way up to a 50-foot, $3 million center console that goes along with the main boat. And certainly whether or not the tender fits on board the main boat or if it is towed behind is one of the main distinctions here. So today we're going to break our discussion down into 3 parts. We're going to talk about the registration of tenders. We're going to talk about their insurance issues, and then we're going to talk about what happens when you want to try to charter your tenders along with the main vessel. So to get started on tender registration. So David, if you have a client, he has a boat that's being a big boat that's being bought. You have tenders that are going along with it. How do you advise your client where to register the tenders and what different considerations go into that analysis?
Thanks, Chris. Well, I have to ask the client some questions about how the tenders are going to be used and where the tenders are going to be used. Over in the Med, for tenders that are small enough to be carried on board and are always going to be used within sight of the mothership, those are commonly not registered or just appear on the record of lifeboats. Over here in the U.S., the Coast Guard and state boating authorities expect anything with a motor to have its own registration. And so even tenders small enough to be carried on board typically have at least a state registration. And usually a state registration in Florida or Delaware suffices, even though once you leave the U.S., that state registration is not the same thing as a U.S. Coast Guard document. As soon as you leave the U.S., that's a stateless vessel. Now, in some places like the Bahamas, they're used to seeing state-registered vessels enough that that's not a problem. But if you're going to be going anywhere farther afield, or if it's possible that the tenders are going to be used separately from the mothership for an extended period, you might want to consider getting an actual registration either with the U.S. Coast Guard or with a foreign flag. The U.S. Coast Guard, you can document anything over 5 net tons, which I think is about 25 feet, and then foreign flags all have various sort of minimum requirements for when you can register there. And the decision about whether you register with the Coast Guard or with another flag, with a foreign flag, there's a lot of factors that go into that, including, as we'll talk about later, whether or not the tender is going to be offered for charter together with the mothership, how often they're going to be used separately, and what the mothership's flag is. So there's a lot that goes into it, but typically the first things you look at are where is it going to be used, and then how is it going to be used? How much time is it going to spend apart from the mothership? Is it ever going to be offered for charter? Those are the kinds of questions you ask to make a recommendation about how to register a tender.
So I think one of the key takeaway points there is that your record of lifeboats, which is and tenders, which is how many, particularly in Europe, many tenders are registered. That's not actually a registration of those for U.S. purposes. So as David said, you're going to require a state registration to operate those vessels in Florida waters and U.S. waters, and that transitioning from a non-registered vessel to an actual registration can sometimes, because the boats the tenders have been used in Europe, they have this record of life boats, but that's not an actual registration that you can transfer title from the record of life boats to a Florida registration or other state registration. So it presents a little bit of a, there are ways around it, but it presents always a little bit of a, it's a little bit of a dance. So Pete, how does Marshall Islands handle tender registrations depending on the size and use of the tender?
Right. So we can register tenders. Our normal registration starts at 12 meters. But if you have a tender smaller than that, as long as you have the mothership registered under the Marshall Islands, we can go down to 7 meters. We also have, we don't call the record of life boats, we have the MI 200A, which is auxiliary vessels and appurtenances. And that encompasses everything from the jet skis to a helicopter or even, a submarine. But for a tender, like I said, it is, 7 meters, it's registered as a private yacht. It will get all its official number and everything like that, and call sign and everything, so you can have separate MMSI for tracking AIS-wise and things like that.
So for your boats that are on the auxiliary vessel list that you guys have for a vessel, does that include tow tenders, or is that just items that can be stored on board?
So we define tenders as a vessel, essentially a rib or fixed craft that is carried or towed. So that's one of our definitions. So it's carried or towed and is used for ship-to-shore, ship-to-ship type operations. Okay. So and essentially, though, if you're doing a dive trip, you're shipped back to the ship. A lot of people ask about limitations. And usually the limitations, most boats will have the recreational directive from the EU, and there'll be a limitation on that, and then it's up to the captain to define, based on weather and kind of limitations.
Okay. And Tom, from an insurance perspective, does how you register the tenders, does that affect the yacht's insurance?
So not necessarily the registration, but often with our larger tenders that are being towed, sometimes we'll see them titled differently in a separate corporation. And that could affect insurance. If you're insured with the P&I Club, the P&I Club automatically provides insurance for your tenders. They don't need to be listed or advised, so they're automatically included. But if you're titling them different, they're going to need a separate certificate or a separate entry into the club. So they're going to need their own certificate and limits of liability there if they're titled separately. The U.S. is a little different if we have U.S. P&I in the hull on it. So they usually endorse the policy just with the tender. They don't really call it a tender if it's being towed, more of an additional vessel. And they're going to have their separate limits. So depending if you're with the P&I Club or on the U.S. side, it's just handled a little bit differently.
Okay. So now that we're talking about insurance, how does increasing the size of your tow tenders affect their insurability?
Well, it depends how big people want to tow. Sometimes we get people that want to tow things that are not going to be acceptable by the insurance company. I think someone mentioned here that the definition, at least on the U.S. side, is a tender that is something that is stored on board, right? Personal watercraft rib. When we get into bigger tenders, most carriers are looking for a tender ratio. They want a tender that is not larger than 35% of the mothership, right? So sometimes we have owners that are coming in at 50%, and you're not going to get tow approval on those. So 35% is that key number if you're looking to buy a tow tender for the mothership, right? Also, the U.S. carriers, when we get into larger boats, they're considered them more independent vessels, right? They're larger. A lot of these big tow boats are going to have full-time captains now, separate captains, separate crew on there. especially in the med, they're navigating further away than a normal tender that we would see stored on board, like a rib. It's just probably going around the yacht, maybe to shore. But these large 50-foot multi-million-dollar tenders, they're going several nautical miles away, 20, 30 miles away to a different port. And in the med, you're going to need a separate entry as well. So that's called a separate entry. They're going to need their own certificates by the port authority there. Fairly easy to do in the P&I club, but we just had to request that in advance. They charge a couple dollars for that separate entry. So that take care of that. Towing, when we're seeing larger vessels, we're seeing a lot more damage and a lot more exposure, right? You're towing a multi-million-dollar potential vessel behind a large yacht. So there is some exposures. We definitely want to see crew and captains on the underwriting side. They're being a little more particular about the experience the captain has with towing tenders in the past. They're looking more for tow surveys to see as long as all the lines and everything's certified, and the towboat has the proper equipment on board. So there's a couple more steps to take when we get into the larger, more valued tow tenders.
So I think that's another key takeaway is your tow tender can be too big to be towed, right? And your insurance company could you could buy a whole, oftentimes insurance is an afterthought, right?
100%. Yeah, always.
Where you've already signed the contract to buy the tow tender, and then you you realize it's uninsurable.
We had people that said, "Hey, we bought a boat 3 weeks ago." You mean like, okay, thanks. Or, like, well, it's down in the med with the yacht. We're chartering. I'm like, okay, well, you have no coverage. Thanks, I'll do it right now. It happens all the time. It's just common in our business. So our phones are on 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. We're emergency response team sometimes. A lot of people. So, but yeah, we get often just they don't understand. So the broker or something sells them a boat that's just way too large to tow, and then often they'll say, okay, we're not going to tow. We'll just operate it and run it. They're going to hire another crew just to operate the boat, so they're not towing the boat, right? And then sometimes we've seen where the captain's owner say, well, we're just going to tow the boat anyways without insurance. Well, we got problems there too, and the owners usually don't want to hear that, or the captains, and sometimes they don't tell us. Though, if you're towing a boat and you don't have approval, let's say it's too large to tow, right? You're jeopardizing the yacht's insurance, because the yacht insurance policy says you can't tow anything without our approval, right? So you're towing this, if you have a mechanical breakdown, and which we know what those losses are, but let's just say a crew member, has a hand severed or something when they're trying to bring the towboat in. We've had a lot of injuries with crew members, releasing the tow and putting the tow back on. So there's no coverage for that, on the liability side, which is a large concern of mine. But also, like I said, maybe the owner doesn't care about losing the $800 million tender, but there's a lot of other exposures that he's taking on by towing a boat that's not approved.
And so I know one of the other questions we got was tow tenders, and why are the deductibles so high?
Well, if you look at the losses, I look at tow tender losses like the silent loss. We see a lot of these yacht losses on social media. They're fires and sinkings and other things. These tow tenders, they're probably starting easy at $1 million now. They're happening offshore. You're not seeing it on social media. You're not seeing the reports on them. The boat takes on water, capsizes, something like that. The captain cuts the line. It's gone. Nobody sees the boat anymore. So frequency, severity is fairly high with these. So the yacht insurance companies are looking at it as more like an independent vessel. We're assessing the risk of towing. And really, it's just because the losses are so large, they're going to be total losses, right? Very rarely have I seen a partial loss on a towboat because the crew's just cutting the boat off. They're just cutting it loose offshore somewhere. I've heard stories, with captains. I'm always interested to find out what happened to the towboat, right? Most of them don't know, but sometimes they try to save the boat. Often the seas are just too rough for them to try to get on board and start the engines or get a crash pump on board. That's what usually captains say. Listen, it's 6 to 8 foot seas. I'm not putting a crew member on there, so we cut the boat loose, right? And usually it's never found. We did have one owner that wanted to retrieve his boat, and we found it out there. But generally, you never see these boats again. They're just gone. I guess you can question why the people are bringing these, towing the boats out there in 6 to 8 foot seas plus. And a lot of responses are, hey, listen, I had a charter, I had to get there, I had to go. Okay, well, 50% tow deductibles are fairly standard in the industry, so we get $1 million loss and the owner's out $500,000. Just a couple of weeks ago, I had $1 million loss on a beautiful 38-foot center console coming back from the Caribbean. 3 foot seas. I saw the videos. It was amazing, beautiful. But they woke up and they said the boat was leaning sideways. They didn't know what was going on, so they tried to speed the boat up to get the water out of it. They couldn't do that. They brought it in. They, disengaged engines, and when they're trying to bring it in to get a crash bump on, the thing just turned over and went down, and they just cut the line. So the owner's out about $450,000 on that. So every policy is a little different. The U.S. policies are pretty good about tow. You're pretty amazed. So generally they're 50% deductible, but they don't put on a lot of different warranties and conditions like we see in London, where London might say, hey, there's a different deductible if you're towing after night. So dusk and dawn, how do we figure that one out? If during sea conditions there's a higher, or you're not allowed to tow in certain sea conditions, well, what if you leave, right, and it's nice, but then the sea conditions go to force 4, which is not allowable, what's going to happen with the claim there? So there's a lot of different differences between U.S. policies and the Lloyd's policies on that. If you guys have any influence on a yacht owner that is towing a vessel, I would highly recommend investing in a tow system, whatever it's a couple $1,000s. When I see these tow losses at 50%, these are seasoned, good captains. If I thought the captain, wasn't, I get that sense, but these are seasoned guys, and they're just losing tenders. We generally don't find out the cause because you're just gone, right? So for the couple $1,000s in the large deductibles, it's worth having these tow monitoring systems on the yachts.
Okay. So you mentioned, getting your vessel and your tender to a charter. So when you start chartering, obviously we all know about, the big boats and, if you're MLC and you're Reg A compliant, or you're PYLC compliant, all the safety rules that are required. But again, tenders, and people just assume that they're okay, to include as part of a charter. But that's not always the case. There's an extra, you have to think about that and make sure your charter has it. Your tender has its proper certifications as well to conduct a charter. So Peter, I know the Marshall Islands. How do you guys handle when an owner wants to charter their tender?
So basically, our policy, and it actually started from about 10, 11 years ago. I guess there were some incidents in the EU, I think around Monaco, where they wanted some verification that tenders are being inspected. So we do have what we call a tender statement of compliance. So any of our charter coded yachts, if you have a tender that you're supposed to, that's going to be part of the charter, you need to have this tender statement of compliance issued. We have a section in our code about what the requirements are for tenders, and then this statement of compliance. So every year, when the boat is inspected, it gets signed off, it gets inspected, we do a rough inspection of the boat. But I will say, because of the size of tenders now have gotten bigger and bigger, we have to consider maybe, because we have some of these support yachts and they have essentially an 80-foot tender. So, we have to look at some of that stuff as well. And there's nothing in place now, but we are looking at that. Is that maybe the inspection at certain size will have to be above just what we do now. But it's a basic inspection of, hey, is the hull in good shape? Is the equipment on board as required? Are the life jackets required? And on that certificate, the tender statement of compliance basically says, okay, you can carry this many people. This is the equipment you have on board and things like that.
Okay. So then, just for tow tenders, right? You have, you'll have a separate registration for them, right?
You can. They're not required, but you don't have to. But generally, if you're towing a tender, your excursions with the tender are probably not going to meet the local regulations for what needs to be. And that's one thing we always say is you have to check with the local regulations as to how tenders are interpreted. Like you say with the U.S., usually a lot of places, I didn't know, tow tender, that's new for me for the U.S. Coast Guard, because for us, it was always just, U.S. Coast Guard was ship to shore. That's all you can do. You can't take your boat up to, a restaurant up the river, without, the Coast Guard getting in trouble unless you have a registration. But yeah, so the tow tender, if it is registered, whether it's registered or not, maybe you need to registered with the Marsh Islands, if it has the Florida, it's still going to carry the tender statement of compliance because it doesn't matter, it has to have that document on board.
Right. So, okay, but so that tender statement of compliance allows that tender to travel. All right, so that's an actually really owner-friendly approach. So how does that differ, David, from what you see with other jurisdictions?
So as I understand it, and I don't speak for any of the registries, but the one that I probably have the most experience with dealing with towed tenders, tag-along tenders, chase boats is the Cayman Islands Registry. If a tender is too large to be carried on board, in order to be offered for charter or together with the mothership, the tender has to have her own separate commercial registration, which means the tender has to meet a commercial code, which most tenders do not. So the situation that Chris described, where you have an owner of a vessel that's active in a Cayman Islands charter program, is working with his broker to find a tender, finds what they think is the perfect tender, and they bring it to you. And my first question is, are you planning to offer this for charter with the mothership? And they said, yeah, what's the problem? And of course, the tender can't be registered as a commercial vessel in Cayman. So then you have a couple of options. One is you could U.S. document the tender and offer the tender for bareboat charter together with the mothership. You don't want to offer for any other kind of charter because you'd have to have something other than a recreational endorsement, which creates citizenship requirements for the master, which is a pain. But then you're in sort of an awkward position because you have the charterer signing a time charter agreement for the mothership and then a separate bareboat charter agreement and cruise services agreement for the tender. And it's just a lot of paperwork. And it only works in the Caribbean. It won't work in the Med because they don't recognize that as a commercial registration, a U.S. documented bareboat charter. So that's one option. And then the other option is you can actually get the tenders coded to meet commercial requirements. The commercial requirements for vessels under 24 meters are significantly more lenient than, for example, the Red Ensign Group code. And there are surveyors who specialize in doing sort of a gap analysis based on review of plans and a physical survey to tell you what would be necessary to enable the tender to be registered as a commercial vessel. And it can involve an investment. Sometimes it's a significant percentage of the price of the tender, but presumably that's something you'd get back on resale. So if the client really wants to offer the tender for charter with the mothership, the best way to do it, in my view, is to register the tender commercially if possible, assuming you want to keep the mothership's flag. So those are your options. You can either use the U.S. flag as a workaround, but there are some drawbacks with that, or you can invest the time and money to actually register the tender commercially if you're working with a different flag state.
Yep, that's sounds like my understanding of it as well. Yeah, it can be ugly if you sign without checking with your lawyers and your insurance representatives. So anyway, are there any questions for us?
Hang on one second, Chris. Let me get to Jim.
I will,
If you want to do that bareboat charter agreement along with the time charter agreement, just use boat docs. It's simple.
Yeah.
It's fast. It's not paper. It's just digits.
What about if Yacht's tender's down and they want to borrow, charter somebody else's tender, either for their own use or for charter?
Well, I mean, certainly, that presents a number of risks. That just off the top of my head, like you have.
That's a liability nightmare for everyone.
For everyone involved, yeah. You have insurance risks.
Depends on the company, but a lot of companies will extend the liability to that chartered tender, right? But they won't extend the physical damage. But like you said, there's probably some more exposures there with crew. But generally, we can see companies extend the liability, but nothing to do with the physical damage.
But if you do that in, say, the Med, you'd have a boat that you take on loan from somebody else and then offer it for charter. You have essentially two charters and potentially owe VAT on both. And it just doesn't make sense.
Do you have any recommendations on how to say no to the charterer when the tender is down and you want to borrow one, but you can't because it's a legal liability? I mean, that's the real world, right? There's a legality.
It does
of it.
happen a lot. I mean, maybe the yacht doesn't have the tender, or they didn't tow the tender to the Caribbean, but they get a charter, only wants to charter the boat if it has a tender. And they
Well,
rent the tender.
My buddy who lives down the street, his boat's down in St. Bart's too, and he brought his tender. So we'll just let our guys use his tender when we're down there, and that way we don't have to both bring them down, right?
If you're doing it on a charter, my recommendation would be, even though there are some transaction costs, do it as a buyback with a mortgage. So title actually passes, and that makes it easier for the person who's operating the tender to insure it in their own name, and then you don't have the risk that that's deemed a charter. So I understand that people may not want to part with ownership of a tender even for a short time, but I think that's the better way to do it.
Any other questions from the audience? Gentlemen, thank you very much. Tom, Chris, David, Peter, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I like your socks, Peter.